Minimalism, a Waltonian analysis, presented by Javon Borst, Laura Cantrell, and Fernando Guerra. Art critics have long battled about the qualities a piece of artwork must have in order to be appreciated by the viewer. Some believe that a piece of artwork must stand or fall completely on its own merit as a visual object. It should require no knowledge of the artist or world history that preceded the object, nor should it require any knowledge of the artist's personal life or philosophies. The followers of this school of thought judge artwork only for its aesthetic properties. In painting, these properties are the colors, shapes, textures, representations, and composition. Kendall L. Walton argues that a work's non-aesthetic properties, such as mood and feeling, are equally characteristic as its aesthetic properties. Frank Sibley suggests that a work's aesthetic properties depend on its non-aesthetic properties. Uniquely, Walton argues that a work's aesthetic properties depend not only on its non-aesthetic ones, but also on which of its non-aesthetic properties are standard, which variable, and which contrastandard. In order to accurately understand these standards in a painting, it is also necessary to relate the painting to perceptually distinguishable categories of works of art. According to Walton, these categories can be media, genre, style, form, and so forth. A piece of artwork can belong to multiple categories. For instance, Monet's Japanese footbridge can belong to the categories painting, impressionism, and plein air. Every time we place a work into a category, our judgments of the work can be altered because of the standards, variables, and contrastandards associated with that particular category. As Walton suggests, in some cases it is correct to perceive a work in certain categories and incorrect to perceive it in others. Features of a work are standard, variable, or contrastandard, respectively, for people who perceive the work correctly. The question is then, how do we determine in which categories a work is correctly perceived? Though Walton admits that there is no well-defined procedure, he outlines 4 helpful strategies to categorize a work of art. The work should contain a minimum number of contrastandard features. The work should belong to the group in which it is most interesting or pleasing, as opposed to how it may be perceived in alternate ways. The artist who produced the work intended or expected it to be perceived or thought of in the category. The category is already established in and recognized by the society in which the work was produced. Walton illustrates the importance of categorizing artworks and using the appropriate historical and societal context as a means to better determine what aesthetic properties a work has and how those properties, with its non-aesthetic properties, make the work coherent. When a painting is perceived correctly, it may be judged solely on what can be seen. Examining a work with the senses by itself cannot reveal how to correctly perceive it, thus placing a great deal of importance on accurately categorizing artwork. For the rest of this presentation, we will be focusing on the minimalism movement. We will examine several works and illustrate how they belong to the minimalism category using Kendall Walton's ideas of standards, variables, and contrastandards. Likewise, we will examine works that are borderline cases and how this may alter the aesthetic judgment of the works.
Interestingly, minimalist art is more commonly associated with sculpture than with painting. According to Robert Atkins, minimalist sculptors hope to transcend the production of mere art objects by producing three-dimensional works that straddle the boundary between art and the everyday world.
When considering what minimalism is, and then placing it within the context of the Waltonian analysis, certain characteristics will naturally arise, at least according to Walton. Walton mentions that there are a number of ways to perceive a work into a particular category. For this instance, he mentions that there are 4 distinct ways in which works are categorized, as mentioned in the introduction of this essay. Minimalism, while broadly discussing it, can be summed up into a body of work that emphasizes geometric forms with industrial materials and applications. Congruently, minimalists encourages the viewer to become more participatory and is often dependent on site specificity. In short, it may also be said that minimalist art is also not as dependent on traditional aspects of art that is, by and large, reliant on metaphor, symbolism, or some form of spirituality. Furthermore, minimalist art can be said to be void of self-expression, which Walton argued was not the most important when it came to understanding art in purely aesthetic ways. To that end, artists such as Judd and Stella made work that seemed void of authorship, allowing the work to stand on its own accord and to speak directly to aesthetic understanding. Additionally, minimalist work could be said to be superficial in that regard, meaning the work, at times, only allows for surface understanding and
Now let us take a look at the works of three artists: Dan Flavin, Donald Judd, and Frank Stella, and examine how they relate to the minimalism category using Kendall Walton's ideas of standards, variables, and contrastandards. The standard or basic features we see in Dan Flavin's Untitled, To a Man, George McGovern, 1972, are the following. First is the use of industrially processed materials, in this case, a series of round fluorescent lights and fixtures. Secondly, we notice plain geometric configurations repeated to create yet another larger geometric shape. Thirdly, we have the use of modern technology, at the time, fluorescent electric lights. Fourthly, a serial arrangement installation of simple forms within an imaginary grid. And finally, a neutral title of Untitled. The standard or basic features we see in Donald Judd's Untitled, 1990, are the following. First, industrially processed materials like anodized aluminum, steel, and acrylic. Secondly, simple geometric configurations repeated to create yet another larger geometric shape. Thirdly, a serial arrangement installation of simple forms within an imaginary grid structure. And finally, a neutral title of Untitled. The standard or basic features we see in Frank Stella's work, K43, are the following. First, industrially processed materials called Protogen, RPT, with stainless steel tubing. Secondly, simple geometric configurations repeated to create yet another larger geometric shape. And finally, a neutral title of K43. The variable features or optional features of Dan's work are the following. First, we have the use of electricity to light up the fluorescent lights. Secondly, the setting in which the work is installed. Thirdly, is the choice of wall color, fixture color, and fluorescent bulb colors. Finally, works are dedicated to everyday individuals that the artist had contact with. The variable features or optional features of Judd's work are the following. First is a choice of color for the painted sections of the piece. Secondly, the location of the installation and its surrounding influence. Finally, the unpainted areas of the piece, specifically the acrylic planes within the rectangles. The variable features or optional features of Stella's work are the following. First, the expressive contours of the thin stainless steel tubing. Secondly, the choice of color combinations on both the large triangular shaped areas and the thin contoured tubing. And finally, the location of the installation and its surrounding influence.
Contrastandards are the qualities in an artwork that could potentially banish the work from the category. According to Walton, in order for an artwork to be included in a category, it should contain a minimum number of contrastandards. The three artworks previously explored in this presentation contain little to no contrastandards, helping them to best fit within the parameters of the minimalist movement. In order to understand Walton's ideas of contrastandards when examining a work's place within a certain category, it is perhaps important to understand why those contrastandards exist. What exactly would prevent a piece of artwork from being considered minimalist? The minimalism art movement flourished in the 1960s, and it developed out of a dissatisfaction with action painting from the previous decade, a form of abstract expressionism that relied heavily on the personal aspects of the art. This means that the personal or self-expressive quality of a work would be contrastandard in minimalism. Abstract expressionism is the antithesis of minimalism. However, minimalism does share similarities with other art movements. It is comparable to conceptual art in that the finished work exists merely to convey a theory. Pop art and minimalism both shared a fascination with the impersonal. Land art also employed minimalism's construction of simple shapes. In the margins of these movements, we can discover the qualities that make their defining artwork something other than minimalism. In other words, we can see what contrastandards are present in those categories that separate them from the standard qualities of minimalism. Conceptual art and minimalism are eerily similar in some regards. Sol LeWitt is often documented in art texts as a minimalist. However, he wrote essays that largely helped to define what conceptual art is. He wrote in his paragraphs on conceptual art, "I will refer to the kind of art in which I am involved as conceptual art. In conceptual art, the idea or concept is the most important aspect of the work. When an artist uses a conceptual form of art, it means that all of the planning and decisions are made beforehand, and the execution is a perfunctory affair. The idea becomes a machine that makes the art. This kind of art is not theoretical or illustrative of theories. It is intuitive. It is involved with all types of mental processes, and it is purposeless. It is usually free from the dependence on the skill of the artist as a craftsman. It is the objective of the artist who is concerned with conceptual art to make his work mentally interesting to the spectator, and therefore usually he would want it to become emotionally dry. There is no reason to suppose, however, that the conceptual artist is out to bore the viewer. It is only the expectation of an emotional kick, to which one conditioned to expressionist art is accustomed, that would deter the viewer from perceiving this art." In short, his conceptual art is also accepted by the minimalism movement because of the way he detaches himself from the objects he produces. The aesthetics of these objects are also standard to those of minimalism, such as his use of plain geometric shapes, series, and industrial materials. However, not all conceptual art fits so neatly in the minimalism category. Works by artists like John Baldessari and Joseph Kosuth contain too many contrastandards to the minimalism movement, such as the use of found objects or ready-mades, or the use of text. In pop art, the absence of personal connection to the art object is standard to minimalism. However, pop art relies heavily on representational imagery that is contrastandard to minimalism. Because of minimalism's reductive influences, its visual representations are limited to simple shapes and forms. A representation of a mass-produced soup can, celebrity, or comic strip would be incorrect to perceive in the minimalism category because of the lifelike rendering of the object, a contrastandard to minimalism. Land art and minimalism each employ the use of simple shapes and forms. However, the use of natural material is contrastandard to minimalism. Minimalists, as previously illustrated, prefer to work with man-made industrial materials. In relation to the earlier minimalist works we discussed, the work by Frank Stella poses the most questionable contrastandards. Art critic Philip Kennicott said in response to Stella's K series, "Stella is testing the tolerance of his viewers, and the capacity of his work, to incorporate coy allusions to the world Kandinsky hoped to leave behind." Kandinsky thought an absolute form of abstract, while Stella allows the world back in through reference, allusion, and of course titles such as Scarlatti K series. The attempt to represent the world, as Kennicott notes, would be contrastandard to the minimalism movement. Traditionally, however, Stella aimed to reject expressionism.
Some problems to note with the Waltonian analysis is that it's too contingent on making sure that the art is placed into the right category. This is a problem because, as he mentions, all viewers will no doubt have differing experiences as it relates to the features, meaning what one person sees as standard, for instance, may indeed be someone else's variable. On the other hand, the Waltonian analysis may lend itself fairly well to minimalist work that seemingly distance itself from authorship, allowing for a more aesthetic understanding, you could say. Though this may indeed come across as a benefit of the Waltonian approach, it may also be said that this is something that Walton himself did not quite achieve in his essay, though he mentioned it was the issue he was concerned with. On the onset, he argued for a way to arrive at aesthetic understanding by understanding the aesthetic and non-aesthetic perceptual properties, but later by utilizing his standard, variable, and contrastandard properties, these two became too reliant on other contextual information that is not necessarily aesthetic, meaning the historical and artist information became important for categorization.
We'd like to conclude our presentation and leave you with this idea to ponder. Minimalists aim to void their work of non-aesthetic properties. Artists like Dan Flavin, Donald Judd, and Frank Stella insisted on creating an art that separated the final product from the personal motives of the artist. Earlier, we noted that some critics feel that it is only important to judge work aesthetically, ignoring all of its history and background. Walton, on the other hand, wished to categorize work and then apply judgment based on the qualities of its appropriate category. When examining minimalist artwork, one may take the Waltonian approach, but in the end, one may still be judging the work solely on its aesthetics, simply because that is one of the main objectives of the movement itself. Thank you.